what did we have after the populists were crushed at the end of the 1900s? We have the movement for the next 15 years or so that's called the Progressive era. And we learn more about that in school than we learn about the populists. And I think it's very important in the process of rethinking how we got here, how we got into this mess, to see that the progressives were almost the opposite of the populists, in that they basically conceded that the corporation would be the dominant institution of our time, and that the best that they could do would be to try to make it a little less bad, to try to find the best men to run it, and to kind of control them around the edges. And so when we got to the New Deal during the Great Depression, it's very important, I think, to understand that it was, in fact, the progressive agenda that the New Deal picked up and not the populist agenda. And so what I learned in school, what I learned through the culture is that, in fact, there was a constitutional revolution during the New Deal. And I think that's way overstated. In fact, none of the issues that we're talking about that gave rise to the corporate state, that enables the corporation to claim constitutional rights and to use the state to wield those rights against us, against our communities, against the animals and plants and the rivers and trees and the mountains, none of that was even challenged. It wasn't on the table.
In my last podcast, the link to which I share below, I shared my understanding of the distinction between populism and progressivism. Populism, I argued, is about people power, whereas progressivism is an elitist ideology and practice that works, or at least functions, to deepen the social logic of capitalism, especially corporate rule. I shared a clip of the notable activist Richard Grossman, who shares this understanding. I opened this podcast with that clip, and I will share more clips of Grossman's speech in this podcast. I want to follow up on my previous podcast because I have become acutely aware that the confusion of ideology makes it difficult for folks to grasp the point I am making, and I feel the point I am making is important to grasp. I know this will sound insulting to some people, but I have to be frank and say that it's sort of tragic, really, that people don't recognize how ludicrous it is to suppose that public education, public infrastructure, public health care, that all these things are socialist. It's strategically stupid to say that they are, because a large portion of the American public believes socialism is bad. According to a recent Pew poll, a majority of Americans have a negative view of socialism. They believe it undermines the work ethic, increases reliance on government, and is un-American. Only 2% of those who have a negative view of socialism believe that a blend of socialism and capitalism is desirable. Moreover, 2/3 of all those polled had a positive view of capitalism. The risk with insisting that the public function of government represents socialism is this. If you could convince Americans that public education is socialist, then they may draw the following conclusion. Why in the world, in a capitalist country, do we have socialist schools? Let's privatize them. Because public schools are socialist. Because they are public. Because the government runs them. They'd probably say something like, let's not get rid of education, of course, because we need educated people. So let's put education in the capitalist market. The fire department, the police department, they're socialist too, because they're run by government. Let's privatize the prisons. Let's privatize the military. Let's put them in the capitalist market. To be sure, and thankfully, a lot of people don't go there because reflexively they know the public function is not socialist. Yet we have folks on the left pushing this line. And they do this in a bizarre attempt to falsely call out conservatives on hypocrisy. You don't want socialized medicine? Well, the fire department's socialist. You want to get rid of the fire department? This was the argument that Jimmy Dore made that I criticized in my previous podcast. The conflation of public and private with capitalist and socialist makes no theoretical or historical sense. These are not equivalencies. And what you're doing with this nonsense is giving ammunition to the privatizers, the privateers, the people who want to turn public functions over to capitalist markets. That's neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is bad for working people. Now, who is advocating this ludicrous point of view? People calling themselves democratic socialist. But they're not really socialist. They're advocating for what used to be called social democracy, nationalized industry, nationalized healthcare. But the term is a little vague. Nationalizing industry is state capitalism. Now that's precise. Nationalized healthcare is a common element in welfare capitalism. And here's the rub. In these schemes, working people pay taxes for services that ultimately benefit the capitalist system by extending and deepening its social logic. It gets public buy-in. This is the work of ideological hegemony. A class-conscious worker demands that the cost of infrastructure and services should be coming out of the surplus value that the capitalist appropriates from the worker. If the economy were democratic, that is, if we lived in an economic democracy, then a portion of the surplus value produced by the worker would go to provide for the public function. Those public institutions would appear in a socialist context. But what's happening in capitalist society is that the lion's share of the value the worker produces goes to the capitalist, and the worker pays taxes on that. He's subsidizing the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, healthcare, the education system. He's subsidizing all of that for the benefit of the capitalist class who needs workers educated in a certain way. Roads and bridges for workers to travel on, and so on. Why does the bourgeoisie control the public school curriculum? Ask yourself, do they teach kids socialism in public schools, or do they teach them the virtues of capitalism? Capitalists need healthy workers, and if they can make those workers pay for the healthcare themselves, this is the peculiar genius of the American system. If you marketize it, then all the better. But even in European social democracies, you pay for your own health care just through taxes. Consider Social Security. Your payroll taxes pay part of it. But remember, your employer is paying his share out of a portion of the surplus value that you produce as a worker. This is a capitalist scheme. It's not socialism. Social Security is not socialist. Now, if it's the best that you can do, then you want it. It's better than nothing. You don't want to lose it. So you have some interest in preserving the scheme because it could be worse. And perhaps it could be a little better. But it could never be that much better. Making it that much better would mean changing the fundamental conditions of society, the fundamental relations of the economic order. That means socialism. But nobody in the Democratic Party is advocating socialism. But what about those self-described democratic socialists? Maybe we aren't so sure what social democracy means anymore, but we have a real good idea of what democratic socialism would involve. Workers owning and controlling the means of production. But that's not what these folks are peddling. They're progressives. Progressives are reformers. This is the reformist wing of the liberal bourgeois class. These reformers have accepted corporate power and corporate rule. They've accepted these as given. So you want workplace safety and consumer safety. I want to know that my products are safe. At the same time, this makes capitalism look progressive. Look how wonderful capitalism is. It takes care of problems. The job creators are problem solvers. We don't think of them as exploiters who are causing problems. You don't need socialism, see? But capitalism doesn't solve these problems. It doesn't solve the problem of the systematic exploitation of human labor, which is the source of inequality and poverty, to have rules in the workplace to protect workers. It does not solve the problem of environmental destruction. It cannot solve these problems, capitalism, because this is the very mode of its operation. This is why the Green New Deal, as great as it sounds, won't go very far in saving the planet. Can't save the planet. That requires the abolition of capitalism. All of these progressive reforms do not change the foundation upon which capitalism rests.
Because the tools that we mostly have been using have been the compromised results of defeats of people who, I'm talking about most of the 20th century, who were not going for the underpinning. Most of the civic activism in this country has been focused on, in a defensive mode, stopping what some other people are trying to impose upon us, stopping some effort by other people to harm our communities, harm us, or deny us rights. One issue at a time, and over and over and over again. Right? And cumulatively, they have not added up in terms of shifting real governing power from the few people who started off running this country in the beginning to the many people who actually live here.